With the advent of modern artillery at the turn of the 20th century, large-scale fortifications had been rendered increasingly obsolete. A complex which could previously delay an army many times the strength of the garrison could now be shelled in relative safety. However, as forts disappeared from the strategic map, they became increasingly important on the tactical. These bunkers and blockhouses could impede the advance of small units of soldiers, and in numbers along a defensive line could hold divisions or entire armies in place. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union found itself with a fairly sizable number of tanks which were becoming obsolete. While other nations may have scrapped or sold them, the USSR had a sizable border that needed defending, and so set about converting these tanks into defensive fortifications. Hello and welcome to another Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host Tony, and today I'll be covering these BOT tanks of the USSR, old tanks that were repurposed into static defense positions. If you like our videos and want to support us, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to improve future Tank Encyclopedia content. Any help would be greatly appreciated. The concept of using a tank as a static bunker was not truly explored until about 20 years after the tank's introduction to the battlefield. The British buried some of their Vickers medium Mark IIs in the desert in Egypt. But for the most part, most nations kept their tanks above ground. During the Second World War, some nations, primarily Germany and the USSR, would entrench tanks in defensive positions or mount tank turrets on bunkers, such as French tank turrets being mounted on the Atlantic Wall. The Soviets were more meticulous with their BOT tanks. Whereas an entrenched tank was expected to eventually move from its position, the BOT tanks were permanent, fixed emplacements. BOT itself comes from bronirованная Oгневая Tочка, which means armored firing point. At its most basic, a BOT could be a simple armored plate above a firing pit, allowing for a soldier to fire with some protection. There were thousands of these BOTs along the Polish-Soviet border as part of the Stalin Line. But with the conclusion of the German and Soviet invasions of Poland, the Soviet border moved westward and the Stalin Line was abandoned. The conversion of tanks into BOTs began in the mid-1930s, but large numbers would not be converted until 1938. Many of these fortifications would see action against German invasion of the USSR, and while many would be lost as the Red Army was pushed back, some would see use up until 1944 in the defense of Leningrad. There was no set method for converting a tank into a BOT. In most cases, the conversion entailed the removal of transmission and engine from the vehicle and the replacement of this with additional ammunition stowage. Additional modifications could include replacing the main gun, adding additional armor, firing points, and armament onto the chassis. However, the process could also be as simple as digging a hole and placing the tank within it. The T-18 was the first tank domestically produced by the Soviet Union. During the interwar period, they served primarily as training vehicles, although some did see limited service in the Far East against the Japanese in border skirmishes. By January 1938, there were some 862 T-18s in service. Of this, 200 were in tank schools, in factories for repairs, or at the testing ground at Kubinka. The remainder were given to the military districts, where most sat in storage without weapons or engines. On March 2nd, the People's Commissariat of Armament ordered the conversion of these tanks into BOT fortifications. This involved installing a new gun mantlet and upgunning the armament to a 45mm K-20. Engines would also be removed and replaced with extra ammunition racks. Not all conversions were equal, however, and at least 2 T-18s in the Leningrad military district not only received a new armament but had their suspensions replaced with 4 PT tank road wheels, 2 per side. This may have been done to ease the movement of the vehicle into its defensive position. At least one T-18 did not receive its 45mm gun, but instead a DA-2 mount for 2 DT machine guns. It is believed that this tank may have actually survived the war, as one T-18 rebuild displays this mount. Most of the T-18s converted into BOTs were simply buried up to the turret ring, although some were simply placed in a trench and left uncovered. Evidence suggests that tanks emplaced using the latter method kept their tracks and running gear intact. By the eve of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the USSR, a relative handful of T-18s had been fully converted into BOTs. Some 450 were in process of being modified, while 150 were being refurbished into operational tanks. Most T-18s were in the north, in the Baltic states and Leningrad military district. Some, however, were further south in areas like Minsk. Many of these T-18s undergoing modification would be abandoned to the Germans as Soviet forces were forced to withdraw. Several T-18 BOTs saw action during the invasion. In the Minsk area, 2 such BOTs were commanded by Sergeant Gvozdev and Private Lopov, who engaged German forces approaching the Drut River. The 2 tanks turned fortifications held off the German advance for a day and claimed 3 tanks and an APC destroyed, as well as a number of soft targets. For their actions, both crews received the Order of the Red Banner of Battle. Other T-18s were employed as BOTs around Leningrad and Moscow, alongside a number of regular T-18s. All T-18s, mobile and static, were lost by November 1942, although some would be recovered by Soviet forces as the war in the East turned against Germany. All surviving T-18s were restored from recovered BOT T-18s. The T-24 was another early Soviet tank design, in some regards little more than an enlarged T-18. Although an order for 300 was initially placed, the introduction of the T-28, a far superior tank design, and a need to use the production lines at the Kharkiv locomotive factory to produce the PT-2 tank resulted in the cancellation of the order just after 25 vehicles. Although the T-24 spent the first half of the 1930s as training vehicles, by the latter half, better training tanks were available. Like the T-18s, they were sent to military districts but in practice were put in storage and otherwise forgotten about. The majority went to the Kharkiv military district, who had 18, with a further 5 going to the tank and artillery proving grounds and a final vehicle in Moscow. Like the T-18s, in March 1938, the T-24s were ordered to be converted into BOTs. 22 T-24s were expected to undergo modifications, and of these, 12 were sent to the Kharkiv and 10 to the Minsk military districts. However, the tanks were first sent to Leningrad for modifications. The T-24 underwent a similar experience to the T-18 with the removal of the engine, although tracks and running gear were untouched. The original 45mm gun was removed and replaced with an L11 76.2mm howitzer. 2 forward-firing Maxim machine guns were added to the front hull, with an additional Maxim mounted on each side at the rear. A 5th machine gun was also installed to the right of the turret. Additional armor in the form of 10mm plates was added to the side of the tanks, as well as a 50mm plate for the front of the turret. A door was added to the rear of the vehicle to allow entry and exit. In the 3 years that the T-24 sat in Leningrad, only 2 of them actually underwent these modifications. None were actually emplaced, and when the depot they were held in was captured by the Germans, the T-24 as well as a number of T-18s fell into enemy hands. What became of these vehicles afterwards is unknown, although a lack of photographs or sightings in combat suggests they may simply have been scrapped by the Germans. Of the remaining 3, 1 was expanded as a ranged target, and a 2nd was listed as operational and was sent to the front lines around Moscow in December 1941. The exact fate of the last T-24 is unknown. The Medium Mark II was a British medium tank design for the mid-1920s. Several examples of the tanks were purchased by the Soviet Union for their own domestic program. However, the design failed to impress, and no more were purchased nor was licensed production pursued. The tanks already purchased were kept in service until 1938 as training vehicles, at which point they were to be converted into BOT fortifications. Like most of the older vehicles waiting to be converted to BOTs, this never happened, and at least 3 of them were captured by German forces somewhere in Belarus or the Baltic states. And that's it for this video. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscription. You can find more information relating to the BOTs in the full article, which is linked in the description. If you like what we are doing and want to let us continue working on these videos, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be allocated to improving our articles and videos for you. Until next time, Keep us in your sights.